The smell of smoke still hung heavy in the Arizona morning air when Lily Carter returned to what had been her home. She'd been in town selling the leather goods she made, the small income that kept her surviving on her isolated claim 5 miles from the nearest settlement of Copper Ridge. The ride back should have been routine, familiar. The path she'd traveled dozens of times carrying supplies to the cabin her father had built before fever took him 2 years ago. Instead, she crested the final ridge and saw black smoke rising against the brilliant blue sky, a column of destruction that made her heart clench with immediate understanding of what awaited below. The cabin was gone. Not damaged, not partially burned, but completely destroyed, reduced to a pile of charred timber and ash that still glowed red in places where fire continued consuming what little remained. Lily sat frozen on her horse, staring at the ruins of everything she owned, everything she'd worked to preserve after becoming orphaned at 15. The vegetable garden she'd carefully watered from the nearby creek was trampled, plants torn from the ground and scattered. The small shed where she'd kept tools and leather-working supplies was also burned, nothing left but the metal implements lying twisted in the wreckage. She dismounted slowly, legs shaking, and walked toward the destruction with the numb feeling of someone moving through a nightmare hoping to wake. The heat was still intense enough that she couldn't approach closely, could only circle the perimeter, looking for anything salvageable, any explanation for what had happened. Lightning strike seemed impossible given the clear weather. Accidental fire made no sense given how carefully she always managed her cooking fire and candles, which left only one possibility that made her stomach turn with mixture of fear and rage. Someone had done this deliberately. The horse tracks told the story. Multiple riders had approached from the east, their prints overlapping near where the cabin had stood, then departing in the same direction. Lily knelt to examine them more closely, her father having taught her basic tracking before he died, and counted at least 4 different horses, maybe 5. The depth of the prints suggested heavy men on well-fed animals, not the desperate outlaws, who occasionally passed through looking for easy targets. These were riders with resources, with purpose. And as Lily stood looking at the destruction they'd caused, memory supplied the likely identity of who and why. 3 days earlier, she'd found a man collapsed near her creek, wounded and exhausted, his hands still bearing rope marks from recent captivity. He was Navajo, which she recognized from the distinctive style of his torn clothing and the turquoise pendant he wore on a leather cord around his neck. He'd been barely conscious, bleeding from a gunshot wound to his shoulder, and clearly running from someone. Lily had faced a choice in that moment: ignore him and avoid potential trouble, or help and risk whatever consequences came with interfering in someone else's pursuit. She'd chosen help. Her father had raised her to believe that humanity mattered more than convenience, that leaving someone to die when you could prevent it was a choice that damaged your soul, regardless of what it did to theirs. So she'd half-carried, half-dragged the wounded man to her cabin, cleaned and bandaged his wound with supplies from her modest medicine box, given him water and the little food she could spare, and made him a pallet on her floor where he could rest while his body tried to heal. He'd told her his name was Tall Pine, that he'd been captured by bounty hunters who planned to sell him to a labor camp across the border, that he'd escaped during transport and been shot while running. He'd thanked her with quiet dignity, said she'd saved his life and that such debts were not taken lightly by his people. Lily had dismissed the thanks awkwardly, uncomfortable with gratitude for doing what seemed obvious, and told him he could stay until he was strong enough to travel safely. She'd been planning to keep him hidden for perhaps a week, then help him get provisions for the journey back to Navajo territory, where he'd be safe from the men hunting him. The bounty hunters had arrived the next morning, 4 men on horseback, led by a brutal-looking character named Rance Cutler, who was known throughout the territory for his complete lack of conscience when it came to making money. They'd demanded entry to search her cabin, claimed they were pursuing an escaped criminal, threatened her with obstruction charges if she didn't cooperate. Lily had stood in her doorway with her father's old rifle, not pointing it at them, but holding it in a way that made clear she knew how to use it, and told them this was her property, and they had no legal authority to enter without a warrant from the territorial marshal. The standoff had lasted perhaps 10 minutes, Cutler trying intimidation and legal threats, while Lily remained stubbornly firm in her refusal. Inside the cabin, Tall Pine had hidden in the root cellar, the small underground space where she stored vegetables and preserved foods. Finally, Cutler had backed down, but not before making it clear that this wasn't over, that he didn't take kindly to interference, that people who made his job harder tended to regret it. They'd ridden away, and Lily had felt the relief of crisis averted, had helped Tall Pine leave that night under cover of darkness, sending him with food and directions to water sources on the route toward Navajo lands. Now, standing in the ruins of her home, Lily understood that Cutler's retreat had been tactical rather than genuine. He'd returned when she was away, had burned everything she owned as punishment for her defiance, as warning to anyone else who might consider interfering with his business. It was revenge and message combined, the response of someone who needed to demonstrate that crossing him carried costs too high for most people to bear. And because Lily was an orphan with no family, no powerful connections, no resources beyond what she could earn with her own hands, Cutler must have calculated that she had no recourse, no way to seek justice or accountability for what he'd done. The rage that filled Lily as she stood among the ashes was cold and clear, different from the hot anger that flared and faded quickly. This was the kind of fury that hardened into determination, that transformed grief into resolve. She'd lost everything material, every possession and comfort she'd worked 2 years to maintain, but she hadn't lost her life or her ability to rebuild. Cutler had tried to break her, to make an example of what happened when someone stood against him. But all he'd actually done was prove that some people would destroy anything, rather than accept defiance from those they considered beneath them. Lily spent the remainder of the morning salvaging what little could be saved from the wreckage. A few metal tools survived, warped by heat but potentially still usable. The cast iron pot she'd cooked in was intact, blackened but functional. Everything else, all the small accumulated possessions that made life comfortable rather than just survivable, was gone. She gathered the salvageable items into a pile, then sat on a rock near the destroyed garden and allowed herself exactly 10 minutes to feel the full weight of loss, to acknowledge the unfairness and cruelty of what had been done to her. When the 10 minutes ended, she stood up and began making plans. She couldn't rebuild immediately, lacked the materials and money that would require. But she could ride to Copper Ridge and report what had happened, could make official complaint and force some kind of response, even if she doubted justice would actually be served. She could also ask around town, try to find work that would earn enough to eventually start over, refuse to let this destruction be the end of her story in Arizona. Her father had taught her that resilience wasn't about never falling, but about always getting back up. And she intended to honor that lesson now when it mattered most. As she prepared to mount her horse for the ride to town, movement in the canyon shadows caught her attention. A figure emerged from between the red rock formations, moving with careful deliberation, and Lily's hand went to the rifle strapped to her saddle before she recognized who was approaching. Tall Pine walked toward her, his wounded shoulder still bandaged but his gait steady, his face grave with expression that suggested he'd seen everything, had witnessed the destruction from hiding, and chosen to return rather than continue his escape to safety. He stopped a respectful distance away and spoke in careful English, words heavily accented but clear enough. He said he'd been traveling toward his homeland when he'd noticed the smoke, had climbed high enough to see her cabin burning and the riders leaving. He'd hidden while the bounty hunters were present, knowing that revealing himself would only have made things worse, would have given them target for violence that might have extended to her directly. But now that they were gone, he'd returned because honor demanded it, because she'd saved his life and the destruction of her home was consequence of that choice, making it his responsibility to address. Lily stared at him, processing the unexpected appearance of someone she'd assumed was long gone, safe in territory where Cutler couldn't follow. She told him this wasn't his fault, that she'd chosen to help him knowing it might cause trouble, that he owed her nothing and should continue running before Cutler discovered he was still in the area. The bounty hunters would be searching, she explained, and staying near her put them both in danger. He needed to protect himself, to get back to his people, not waste time worrying about consequences she'd accepted when she made her choice. Tall Pine listened without interrupting, then responded with quiet firmness that made clear he'd already considered and rejected her arguments. He said that among his people, life debts were sacred. that allowing someone who'd saved you to suffer without attempting to help was violation of fundamental honor. He couldn't force her to accept his assistance, but he also couldn't walk away knowing she'd been harmed because of kindness shown to him. If she would allow it, he would help her seek justice or compensation or whatever response she deemed appropriate to what had been done. He had skills and knowledge that might prove useful, and he was willing to delay his return home until her situation was resolved or at least improved. The offer was unexpected and complicated, bringing up questions about what justice would even look like. How an escaped Navajo warrior and an orphan girl could possibly challenge men like Cutler, who operated with impunity throughout the territory. But looking at Tall Pine's serious expression, at the determination behind his quiet words, Lily felt something shift inside her. Maybe she wasn't as alone and powerless as Cutler had assumed. Maybe there were resources and alliances he hadn't anticipated. Maybe his revenge had inadvertently created opposition stronger than what he'd tried to destroy. She accepted Tall Pine's offer with simple nod, too emotionally exhausted for lengthy discussion of plans or possibilities. Together they began the ride toward Copper Ridge, toward whatever came next. Two people who shouldn't have been allies by any conventional understanding, but who'd been bound together by circumstance and choice into partnership that might prove more formidable than either of them looked. The smoke from Lily's destroyed cabin rose behind them, marking the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. Proof that sometimes the worst thing that could happen was also the thing that revealed who you really were and what you were actually capable of becoming. The ride into Copper Ridge took 3 hours, giving Lily time to think about how to approach what came next and to learn more about the man riding beside her. Tall Pine had worked as scout and translator before his capture, serving various army units and civilian expeditions through territory that required indigenous knowledge to navigate safely. He'd been good at his work, respected by the officers he'd served, until he'd witnessed something that changed everything. A supply shipment meant for Navajo families as part of treaty obligations had been diverted by corrupt officials, sold to private buyers, while families went hungry. When Tall Pine had reported this to his army commander, he'd inadvertently exposed a scheme involving multiple people, including Rance Cutler, who'd been arranging the illegal sales. The retaliation had been swift and vicious. False charges of theft were filed against Tall Pine, warrants issued that allowed Cutler to capture him legally. The plan had been to transport him across the border and sell him to a mining operation where indigenous workers were used essentially as slaves, where he'd disappear into a system that officially didn't exist and unofficially was widespread. Tall Pine's escape had disrupted that plan and cost Cutler money, which explained the intensity of his pursuit and his willingness to burn Lily's cabin as punishment for her interference. Understanding this context made Lily's situation more complicated but also more clear. This wasn't just about her destroyed home, was part of a larger pattern of corruption and exploitation that touched many lives beyond her own. Cutler wasn't just a bounty hunter, but an active participant in schemes that violated laws and treaties, someone who'd built his livelihood on systems designed to profit from others' suffering. Bringing him to justice would require more than just complaining about a burned cabin, would need evidence and witnesses willing to testify, and officials who couldn't be bought or intimidated. They reached Copper Ridge as afternoon sun turned the desert landscape into shades of gold and red. The small town spread across a valley between canyon walls that provided some shelter from the relentless wind. Lily knew most of the permanent residents by sight, if not by name, the shopkeepers and craftspeople and families who'd settled here, because the nearby mines provided just enough economic activity to sustain modest community. She also knew the town's limitations. The nearest territorial marshal was 2 days' ride away. The local judge held court only once monthly, and the unofficial power structure was heavily influenced by people with money and guns, which often meant people like Cutler. Lily's first stop was the general store, where she asked to speak with Samuel Chen, the owner and one of the few people in town she trusted, to be honest. Samuel was Chinese-American, had faced his own share of prejudice and exploitation, working railroad construction before saving enough to buy the store, and had always treated Lily fairly when she came to trade her leatherwork for supplies. When she explained what had happened, his face darkened with anger that matched her own. But he also immediately grasped the challenges she'd face seeking any kind of accountability. He explained that Cutler had connections throughout the territory, that several town officials received payments for looking the other way when his activities skirted or crossed legal boundaries, that bringing formal complaints would likely result in those complaints being dismissed or ignored. Samuel had seen it happen before, had watched people try to challenge Cutler's operations only to find themselves facing mysterious legal problems or economic pressures that forced them to withdraw their accusations. The system was corrupt enough that working through official channels often meant nothing except making yourself a target for further retaliation. Lily listened to this discouraging assessment, then asked the question that mattered. Was Samuel saying she should do nothing? Should just accept the destruction of her home without seeking any response? Samuel's reply was careful but supportive. He wasn't suggesting acceptance, but rather that she needed to be strategic about how she pursued justice. That direct confrontation with Cutler would end badly for her. What she needed was leverage, was evidence that couldn't be dismissed, was alliances with people who had resources and standing that she lacked. And most importantly, she needed to document what had happened in ways that created permanent record, so that even if immediate justice proved impossible, the foundation would exist for eventual accountability. Tall Pine had remained silent during this conversation, understanding enough English to follow the discussion, but recognizing that his presence might complicate things if Samuel was uncomfortable dealing with an escaped prisoner. But Samuel surprised them both by addressing Tall Pine directly, saying he'd heard about the supply diversion scheme and had suspected Cutler's involvement, that having witness to that corruption was valuable if it could be presented properly. He asked if Tall Pine would be willing to provide written testimony about what he'd seen, and whether he could identify others who'd been involved in the theft and sale of treaty goods. The question opened possibilities that Lily hadn't fully considered. If Tall Pine's testimony could be combined with her complaint about the burned cabin, if they could connect Cutler's retaliation against her to his larger pattern of criminal activity, they might create case strong enough that territorial authorities couldn't ignore it completely. It wouldn't be easy, would require navigating legal systems neither of them fully understood, but it was something concrete to pursue, was path toward accountability rather than just acceptance of injustice. Samuel offered his store's back room as place to write out formal statements, providing paper and ink and helping Lily and Tall Pine compose documents that detailed everything. Tall Pine's witnessing of the supply theft, his false arrest and planned sale into forced labor, his escape and injury, Lily's assistance and the bounty hunter's initial confrontation, the burning of her cabin as retaliation. All of it laid out in careful chronological order, with as much specific detail as they could remember. Samuel signed as witness to their statements, adding his own testimony about Cutler's reputation and the general knowledge around town that he operated outside legal boundaries with protection from corrupt officials. While they worked on the documents, word spread through Copper Ridge that the orphan girl whose cabin had been burned was in town with a Navajo warrior, that something significant was happening at Samuel's store. Several townspeople appeared, some out of curiosity, others because they had their own grievances against Cutler or knew people he'd harmed. A widow whose husband had died working in Cutler's illegal mining operation offered to testify. A rancher whose water rights had been stolen through forged documents Cutler had arranged added his statement. A Mexican family whose son had been taken for forced labor and never returned contributed their story. One by one, people who'd been silent out of fear or hopelessness found courage to speak when they saw others doing the same, creating document collection that painted devastating picture of systematic corruption. Samuel took charge of organizing these testimonies, his merchant's mind understanding the importance of documentation and presentation, creating portfolio that laid out pattern of criminal activity spanning years and affecting dozens of people. He also drafted letter to the territorial marshal, summarizing the evidence and requesting formal investigation, emphasizing that this wasn't isolated complaint from powerless individuals, but documented pattern from multiple sources that demanded official response. The letter was strong, but Samuel warned them not to expect quick action, that even with compelling evidence, bureaucracy moved slowly and corruption had ways of delaying or derailing investigations. As evening fell, Lily faced practical question of where to sleep and what to do next. Her cabin was destroyed. She had almost no money. And waiting in Copper Ridge for territorial marshal who might not come for weeks seemed both dangerous and unsustainable. Several townspeople offered temporary shelter, but Lily worried that accepting would put them at risk if Cutler decided to escalate his retaliation. She was considering whether to camp outside town when unexpected solution appeared in the form of Catherine Bowers, owner of the largest boarding house in Copper Ridge. Catherine was widow in her 50s, who'd built successful business through combination of hard work and shrewd judgment about people and opportunities. She told Lily she could work at the boarding house in exchange for room and board, that there was always need for someone who could do laundry, cooking, and general maintenance. The offer was practical rather than charitable, employment rather than handout, which made it acceptable to Lily's pride in ways that pure charity wouldn't have been. Catherine also made clear that she wasn't intimidated by Cutler, that her late husband had been former army officer, whose connections still provided her some protection against the kind of retaliation that threatened people with less standing. Tall Pine's situation was more complicated. He couldn't stay in town without risking recognition and recapture, but leaving meant abandoning the effort to seek justice and hold Cutler accountable. The solution came from unexpected source. Father Miguel from the small mission church on town's edge offered sanctuary. He said the church had tradition of providing refuge to those seeking protection, that territorial law generally respected religious sanctuary, even when civil authorities wanted to arrest someone, and that he personally believed Tall Pine's testimony about corruption warranted supporting him, despite the legal complications of his escaped prisoner status. The arrangements weren't perfect, carried risks and uncertainties that kept Lily awake most of her first night at Catherine's boarding house, listening to sounds of unfamiliar building and thinking about everything that had changed in a few short days. She'd gone from independent survival on her own land to being dependent on others' hospitality, from obscurity to visibility, from isolation to being surrounded by people who'd chosen to ally themselves with her cause. It wasn't the life she'd planned or wanted, but it was the situation she faced. And as her father had often said, you dealt with the hand you were dealt, rather than wishing for different cards. The next morning brought news that crystallized both the danger and the opportunity of their situation. A rider arrived from the territorial capital, carrying responses to Samuel's letter and the testimony portfolio. The territorial marshal was indeed launching investigation into Cutler's activities, sending deputy to gather additional evidence and interview witnesses. But the same mail delivery brought warning from sympathetic contact. Cutler had learned about the testimony gathering, knew that Lily and Tall Pine were in Copper Ridge, and was planning response that would eliminate the evidence and silence the witnesses before the deputy marshal could arrive. The race was on, and Lily understood that the next few days would determine not just whether justice was served, but whether she and Tall Pine and everyone who'd supported them would survive Cutler's efforts to protect his corrupt operation. But looking around the boarding house at the people who'd chosen to help, remembering the stack of testimonies that documented years of harm, feeling Tall Pine's quiet presence as ally in fight she'd never intended to join, Lily felt something she hadn't experienced since finding her cabin in ashes. She felt hope. Not naive optimism that everything would work out easily, but realistic hope that came from understanding that she wasn't facing this alone, that courage could be collective rather than just individual, and that sometimes the worst thing that happened was also the catalyst that finally brought wrongdoing into light, where it could be challenged and potentially overcome. Cutler made his move 3 days later, arriving in Copper Ridge with 8 hired guns, men who made their living through intimidation and violence, whose presence in town sent immediate message about his intentions. They took over the saloon, making it clear through aggressive posturing and casual threats that anyone who testified against Cutler or supported Lily would face consequences. The deputy marshal was still 2 days away according to the latest communication, which meant Copper Ridge had to survive 48 hours of pressure before help arrived, had to hold steady against men who specialized in making people too frightened to maintain resistance. Lily watched from the boarding house window as Cutler's men patrolled the streets, noting faces, identifying everyone who'd been involved in gathering testimony. Samuel's store was their first target, not with violence but with economic pressure. They positioned themselves outside and made clear that anyone entering would be remembered, that doing business with someone who'd cooperated with investigation would mark you as enemy. Within hours, Samuel's usual customer traffic had dried up almost completely. People too afraid to risk association with someone Cutler had targeted. Catherine Bowers responded by sending Lily to Samuel's store with boarding house shopping list, making statement that she wouldn't be intimidated and that her business would continue supporting people she respected. Several other townspeople followed Catherine's example, creating small stream of customers who refused to let fear dictate their choices. It wasn't dramatic resistance, wasn't confrontation that would make good stories, but it was real defiance, was ordinary people choosing principle over safety in small ways that accumulated into something significant. The second day of Cutler's occupation brought escalation. One of his men started fire in an abandoned building near the mission church, obvious attempt to threaten Father Miguel and the sanctuary he'd provided Tall Pine. The fire was quickly extinguished by townspeople who'd organized bucket brigade, but the message was clear. Nowhere was safe, no protection was absolute, and cooperation would continue until people surrendered and abandoned their testimony. Father Miguel responded by ringing the church bells, gathering townspeople for emergency meeting to discuss how to respond to what was effectively siege of their community. The meeting revealed divisions that had been hidden beneath Copper Ridge's surface. Some people argued for withdrawing the testimony, said Cutler wasn't worth the trouble he was causing, suggested that Lily and Tall Pine should leave town and let things return to normal. Others insisted that normal meant accepting corruption and exploitation, that this was opportunity to finally challenge system that had harmed many people over years, that backing down would only embolden Cutler to escalate future abuses. The debate grew heated, revealing years of accumulated frustration and fear and disagreement about how to respond to power that seemed immune to accountability. Lily stood to speak, her voice shaking slightly, but growing stronger as she continued. She said she understood people's fear, didn't blame anyone who wanted to withdraw from conflict they hadn't chosen. But she also knew that Cutler had burned her home as punishment for simple act of kindness, had tried to destroy her life because she'd saved someone who was injured. If they backed down now, if they let fear determine their choices, what would stop him from escalating next time? What would prevent worse actions against people with even less power to resist? She wasn't asking anyone to risk themselves for her sake, but she was going to continue pursuing justice, whether she had support or not, because accepting injustice without resistance meant becoming complicit in a system that harmed everyone eventually. The speech wasn't eloquent or practiced, wasn't the kind of rhetoric that inspired dramatic transformations, but something about Lily's raw honesty, about her willingness to stand alone if necessary, while acknowledging others' legitimate fears, shifted the energy in the room. One by one, people who'd been wavering recommitted to supporting the investigation, to maintaining their testimony, to standing against Cutler's intimidation. It wasn't unanimous. Some people left the meeting and quietly withdrew their statements, but enough remained that the foundation of evidence stayed solid, stayed strong enough to pursue accountability if they could just survive until the deputy marshal arrived. That night, Cutler played his final card. He came to Catherine's boarding house with 4 of his men, demanding to speak with Lily, making clear through aggressive posturing that he wasn't requesting but commanding. Catherine met him at the door with rifle in her hands, not pointing it at anyone but holding it ready, and told him that her property wasn't subject to his bullying, that if he had business with Lily, it could be conducted in the morning with witnesses present and proper protocols followed. The confrontation was tense, Cutler clearly considering whether to force entry, calculating whether assaulting a respected widow would create problems that outweighed benefits of silencing Lily immediately. Before the situation could escalate into violence, Tall Pine appeared from the shadows of the building's side, moving with silent speed that caught everyone by surprise. He positioned himself between Cutler's men and the boarding house entrance, unarmed but standing with the kind of readiness that made clear he was prepared to fight if fighting became necessary. His presence changed the calculation, added unpredictability that made forcing entry seem more complicated and risky. Cutler stared at Tall Pine with recognition and hatred, seeing the escaped prisoner who'd cost him money and credibility, clearly wanting to finish what he'd started when he'd captured and tried to sell him. Tall Pine spoke in careful English, his words carrying across the tense space between armed men and defended property. He said that Lily had saved his life when no one else would help, that she'd lost everything because of kindness shown to him. That honor required him to defend her now, when she faced threat from men who valued nothing except their own profit and power. He said he was prepared to die if necessary to prevent harm coming to her. That life lived without honor wasn't worth preserving. That Cutler could try to force his way past, but would discover that some debts were paid regardless of cost. The declaration was simple, but powerful, carrying weight that came from absolute sincerity, from willingness to back words with action. Cutler's men shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that what had seemed like easy intimidation of a vulnerable woman had become something more complicated, would require violence that might not end in their favor. Cutler himself seemed to be calculating, trying to decide whether pressing forward would accomplish his goals or simply create martyr story that would strengthen rather than weaken the testimony against him. The standoff broke when Sheriff Anderson arrived, drawn by reports of armed men threatening boarding house. Anderson was local law enforcement, generally ineffective against Cutler's operations, because he lacked resources and authority to challenge someone with territorial connections, but his presence provided excuse for de-escalation. He told Cutler that threatening citizens in the street was disorderly conduct, that whatever grievances existed could be addressed through proper channels, that everyone needed to disperse and return tomorrow in daylight with cooler heads. It wasn't brave intervention, wasn't the kind of law enforcement that would stop corruption, but it was enough to give Cutler reason to back down without losing face. As Cutler and his men departed, he made point of looking directly at Lily and saying that this wasn't over, that running to the law wouldn't protect her, that there were ways to handle problems that didn't involve marshals or courts. The threat was explicit, meant to terrify, but Lily found herself less frightened than she'd expected. She'd already lost her home, had already faced the worst Cutler could do to her materially, and what remained was just life itself, which she'd risk gladly rather than live in constant fear of men who believed power made them entitled to hurt people without consequence. The deputy marshal arrived the next morning, a weathered man named John Crawford, who'd served as lawman for 20 years and had reputation for being honest and thorough. He spent the day interviewing witnesses, examining the testimony portfolio Samuel had assembled, investigating the burned remains of Lily's cabin, and gathering additional evidence about Cutler's operations. By afternoon, he'd issued warrant for Cutler's arrest on multiple charges including arson, corruption, theft of government property, and conspiracy to engage in human trafficking through his operation, selling captured indigenous people into forced labor. The arrest happened publicly, in Copper Ridge's Main Street, with Crawford backed by several deputized townsmen who'd volunteered to support him. Cutler tried to bluster and threaten, claimed he had connections that would see the charges dismissed, insisted that Crawford was making career-ending mistake by going after someone with his influence. Crawford listened without reaction, then simply stated the charges and informed Cutler he could make his arguments to the territorial judge, that law enforcement dealt with evidence, not with threats, and that resisting arrest would add additional charges to the already substantial list he faced. Watching Cutler being led away in shackles felt surreal to Lily, like witnessing something that shouldn't have been possible becoming real through accumulation of small choices and collective courage. It wasn't complete victory. The trial would take time and conviction wasn't guaranteed given Cutler's connections, but it was accountability where there'd been none before. Was powerful man facing consequences rather than escaping them through intimidation and corruption? The town watched in stunned silence, processing the significance of seeing someone who'd operated with impunity for years, suddenly subject to law he'd always seemed above. In the days that followed, while Cutler sat in the territorial jail awaiting trial, Copper Ridge began processing what had happened and what it meant. Catherine offered Lily permanent position at the boarding house, recognizing that rebuilding her cabin would take time and resources she didn't currently have. Samuel approached Tall Pine about working at the store as assistant and translator, position that would provide legitimate employment and legal protection while his status was resolved through proper channels. The offers weren't charity, but recognition of value, of contributions these two people had made, not just in bringing down Cutler, but in demonstrating that resistance to corruption was possible even for people who seemed powerless. Father Miguel worked with territorial authorities to regularize Tall Pine's legal situation, arguing that the charges against him had been fraudulent, that he'd been victim rather than criminal, that his testimony had exposed corruption that served public interest. The process was slow and bureaucratic, but initial signs were positive that his escaped prisoner status would be resolved in his favor, that he'd be cleared of false charges, and potentially even compensated for his wrongful capture and attempted sale into forced labor. 3 months after her cabin had burned, Lily rode out to her land with Tall Pine beside her, surveying the clearing where she'd build again. The burned remains had been cleared away. Timber had been purchased with money donated by townspeople who'd wanted to help, and construction would begin the following week with volunteers from Copper Ridge who'd offered their labor. The new cabin would be larger than the old one, built with better materials and technique, incorporating knowledge from both settler and Navajo building traditions that Tall Pine had shared during their growing friendship. Standing on land that had seemed lost just months before, Lily felt the full weight of everything that had changed. She'd lost material possessions but gained community, had faced destruction but found allies, had been targeted for showing kindness and ended up catalyzing justice that helped many people beyond herself. Tall Pine had honored his debt not through dramatic rescue or violent revenge, but through standing with her, through lending his testimony and presence to efforts that relied on law rather than force, through demonstrating that defending honor sometimes meant choosing patience and persistence over immediate satisfaction of confrontation. The trial would happen in coming months, and Cutler's conviction, while likely, wasn't guaranteed, but regardless of that outcome, something fundamental had shifted in Copper Ridge and the surrounding territory. People who'd felt powerless had discovered they could organize and document and demand accountability. Corrupt officials had learned that there were limits to impunity, that even small communities could fight back when they chose solidarity over isolation. And one orphan girl who'd offered simple kindness to a wounded stranger had proven that small acts of conscience could have consequences far beyond immediate moment, could ripple outward into transformation that changed not just individual lives, but the systems that shaped entire communities. As the sun set over the red rock canyons that surrounded her land, painting the Arizona landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Lily thought about the future she was building, about the life taking shape from ashes of destruction. It wasn't the life she'd planned or expected, wasn't simple survival on isolated claim, but something larger and more connected, built through relationships formed in crisis, and maintained through mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. Her cabin had burned, but what rose from those ashes was something stronger than timber and nails, was community and courage, and the understanding that honor recognized no boundaries of culture or circumstance, that defending it sometimes meant standing against those who believed power made them untouchable, and that victory sometimes looked like just refusing to be destroyed by those who tried.